Hello, I'm Deanne Hines, and I'm back because I want to share with you some research that I unearthed um, writing my debut novel, Conquerabia, The Struggle for Identity. So it surrounds how mail was mobilised during the late 18th century. So when we think of sending mail today, it's a simple process of write a letter, affix a stamp, and drop it in the nearest postbox. But in the late 18th century, long before the introduction of the iconic Royal Mail stamp that we recognise today, the process of sending mail and receiving letters was far more complicated and often expensive. In an era of growing empires, developing trade routes, and political upheaval, reliable communication was crucial, but it wasn't that easy. So I'm going to take you back in time to show you how mail was handled in this period, long before the convenience of a standard postal system that we know today. So the packet ship network, crossing the seas with letters. One of the most important elements of 18th century mail delivery, particularly for long distances, was the use of packet ships. These vessels were specialised for transporting mail, passengers and sometimes goods across oceans. Operating on fixed schedules, packet ships ensured that mail could travel between major ports in Europe and Americas. Operating on fixed schedules, packet ships ensured that mail could travel between major ports in Europe, the Americas and the Caribbean, as well as to other colonial territories. A letter sent from London to, say, New York or the West Indies might take weeks or even months to arrive. Depending on the weather and the state of the seas, packet ships were faster and more reliable than merchant vessels because they prioritised communications over cargo, and they played a crucial role in maintaining diplomatic and commercial ties between far-flung British colonies and their mother country. But the journey by sea was only part of the process. Once the letter reached its destination port, there was still a long way to go before it reached its intended recipient. Overland, letters were transported by a network of postboys or mounted couriers and later by postal coaches. In many regions, this was a dangerous and challenging job. The couriers had to navigate poor road conditions, bad weather, and even highwaymen who saw the transport of valuable correspondence as an opportunity for theft. Postal coaches became more common as roads improved. Introduced towards the end of the 18th century, horse-drawn carriages carried both passengers and mail between towns, stopping at coaching inns along the way to change horses and allow for rest. The introduction of postal coaches helped speed up mail delivery, but it was still a far cry from today's modern efficiency. One of the major differences between mail in the 18th century and today was who paid for the service. Unlike today, where the sender buys a stamp, the recipient of the letter was responsible for paying postage upon delivery. The cost of sending a letter depended on several factors, including the distance it travelled and the number of sheets of paper used. The system created problems. If a letter arrived but the recipient couldn't afford the postage, the letter might be refused. This led to the development of ingenious ways to circumvent the system, such as sending a letter written in code on the outside of the folded paper, allowing the recipient to read the message without having to open or pay for the letter. How naughty is that? So postal systems in the late 18th century were often regulated by governments with varying rates and services. In Britain, for instance, the General Post Office, the GPO, was established much earlier than in 1660, but by the 18th century it was beginning to expand its services. Rates for sending letters were calculated by both distance and weight, and postal clerks used standardised charts to calculate charges. Although governments were keen to facilitate the flow of information, particularly for political and commercial reasons, the high cost of sending letters meant that mail services were still primarily used by the wealthy, business people, or government officials. The late 18th century was a period of expansion in many ways, and the postal system was no exception. The British Empire in particular required a reliable means of communication across its far-reaching colonies. The use of mail coaches and packet ships facilitated this, but there were still many challenges. Mail could be delayed by wars such as the American Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars, and by natural obstacles like storms at sea. One of the key innovations during this period was the use of postmarks. Post offices would stamp a letter with the date and location of its origin, allowing officials and recipients to track where and when it had been sent from. These postmarks were the precursors to the postage stamps that would later become essential to mail systems worldwide. It wasn't until 1840 that the postage stamp, as we know it today, was introduced in Britain with the penny black, marking the birth of the modern postal system. This innovation revolutionised mail delivery as it placed the responsibility for paying postage on the sender, simplified the rate structure, and made communication more accessible to the general public. But in the late 18th century, however, sending a letter was still a time-consuming and often expensive affair. Whether by land or sea, through postal coaches or packet ships, the journey of a letter was an adventure in itself, crossing treacherous seas, dangerous highways and political boundaries. Yet even in this complex pre-stamp era, the need for communication helped drive innovation and create the foundations of the global postal system we rely on today. So the handling of mail in the late 18th century was a far cry from the streamlined systems we use today. Packet ships braving the Atlantic to postal coaches, rattling across rutted roads, every letter had a long and often perilous journey. Although expensive and unreliable by modern standards, the postal networks of this era laid the groundwork for the innovations that would soon follow, transforming global communications and shaping the world as we know it. By the time the first postage stamp was introduced in the 19th century, the groundwork for a truly international postal service had already been laid, thanks to the courage and creativity of those who handled the mail in the 18th century. Isn't that fascinating? Thank goodness for the Royal Mail we know. You can get my book Conquer Abia, The Struggle for Identity, on Amazon. Get your copy now.